Good afternoon, everyone. We are so pleased that you are joining us for our webinar presentation, Navigating Technology with Your Tweens. This is a unique opportunity where we have seized parent initiative and concern regarding internet safety and social media for their children, and we've enlisted the guidance of our professional team to canvass both parents and students about topics of concern and to be able to report back to you as we approach the summer with helpful guidelines to understand the phenomenon that tweens undergo in their interface with today's technology and social media, and to give you guidance as to how to help your children navigate these areas which are so challenging yet have become a part of our everyday experience. We are very, very lucky to be able to present Dr. Linda Goldman, Director of Guidance in the Yeshiva of Elizabeth Division of the Jewish Educational Center, Dr. Akiva Perlman, the Director of Guidance in the Rav Teitzman Sifta Academy of the Jewish Educational Center, and Rabbi Ariel Shaked, LAC, Associate Administrator of the Yeshiva of Elizabeth, also a licensed mental health counselor who practices outside the building in the JFS in Clifton, New Jersey. We are hopeful that the information you receive will help you guide your children as they mature into adult users of modern technology and social media. Without further ado, Dr. Linda Goldman.
Hi, and welcome to our webinar. We would like to welcome you this afternoon and tell you that this program is an outgrowth of parental concern about your children and their use of computers, phones, and social networking. All of this has exploded in the world that we live in. As you all know, you and your children filled out a questionnaire about technology and your children's use of it. First of all, we'd like to applaud all of you because we found a large group of parents who are really working hard to create rules and reasonable limits as their children navigate the world of computers, phones, and social media. What we hope to do today is give you a brief overview of the developmental stage of adolescence. Then Dr. Perlman will share his findings from the survey that was conducted. And finally, Rabbi Shaked will offer some recommendations as we journey into the summer months coming up. Adolescence, as you all know, is a time when children start to become their own person. They begin to separate from their parents, and they look to be their own people. They push to make decisions, and really their friends, their peer group becomes a very powerful dynamic in their lives. Not only their peer group, but they look for new sources of stimulation. What once was enough stimulation is now insufficient. They look to push out the envelope, to push the limits, and try new things. They like to be risk takers, and they need us to help them put limits on some of that. But this push for independence and freedom, we need to acknowledge, is really a normal part of development. It's normal, biologically driven by the brain. It's a healthy and necessary process in the journey of becoming an adult. In our present society, adolescence seems to be starting earlier and earlier. We really see children between the ages of 9 and 12 becoming clearly early adolescent, and we've come to term them tweens. Tweens begin to develop their own sense of self and seek out information, not only from their parents now, but from peers, from the media, from everything around them. As you're all aware, the peer group begins to dramatically influence their decision-making process, already in 5th and 6th grade. Kids seek new experiences, they take new risks, and they look to develop an identity of their own. They're not as good as we are at making decisions. They often lack the knowledge, the problem-solving skills, the looking at options, and they often cannot predict consequences. Therefore, positive adult role models are critical in shaping their decision-making process. All adolescents are not always aware of potential dangers that surround them. Their peers are not often good sounding board, so they need us to limit some of the things that they do. Right now, we would like to make a couple of recommendations as we go along. So one thing I'd like to suggest is that protective factors is something that's very helpful in enhancing the social and emotional growth of adolescents. And one of those protective factors is family. A warm family where criticism is constructive, where expectations are realistic, and rules are very clear, help kids stay within normal boundaries. It helps them problem solve, and it helps them stay safe. Remember, when your children were young, you taught them to eat, to bathe, to dress, and now we're moving on to teaching our children to socialize appropriately. We want them to develop sophisticated skills in dealing with technology, with dealing with social media. We want them to be appropriate. So as we help them with the rules now, you need to see that they're internalizing these rules now, and that will hopefully help them as they move into high school to be appropriate as they venture further away from us and seek more freedom and more independence. So look at it as a way to help them get where they need to go. This is stage one as we segue to high school. And without further ado, I present Dr. Perlman, who has the information about the survey you all took. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Goldman. It's so valuable working with you. Time together. Firstly, I'd like to thank all of you parents for joining us in this venture. There's no greater professional, personal satisfaction that I can get than involving you in this process with me. One thing that these results show is that this issue is going to be one of the biggest issues of our generation. And I think that we've researched the high school students, we're now researching elementary school students, and what we're finding is that the results are quite dramatic as to how this how this takes form and how this ultimately develops. So there's no greater relationship than the ones in joining together with you in this process and feeling connected and feeling like we can communicate. And I'm glad that we have this opportunity now to open up this process. Now, for starters, one thing that's good, there's been a great deal of research that's taken place, things that we already know, things that researchers before us have looked at and found to be very effective. Now, but at the same time, while there's so much that we already know, we still remain in a constant state of learning and of growth. Now, one thing we know is that these are the basics that are out there, the agreed upon stable forces when it comes to addressing technology, the use of technology with our children. Understand what's out there, teach your children how to protect their identity, to not go out, to look for predators, so to speak, filters, software, managing time, and keeping computers away from private areas so you gain access and control over what they're seeing. However, we know all of this information, yet we still find that there's a great struggle in the results that we're going to have in our study that we did here. We still find a great struggle with trying to manage and maintain a sense of control, and I think even more than that, a sense of power as a parent. One of the big challenges, and one of the reasons for this, is that it's not only an adolescent-based issue, and it's not only a tween issue. This is an adult issue as well. I remember the first time that I got this message, my daughter made very clear to me. It was her first form of communication, where before she could even speak, she saw me. I just got the new iPhone. I was very excited about it. And my son was taking a bath. She literally took, before she could say anything, she took the phone out of my hands, walked directly to the bath, and dumped it in the bath. It was her way of saying, Dad, Abba, I want you to get off the phone. And so what we have found is that while we're talking about this issue being largely adolescent-based and developmental-based, one of the reasons why it's so hard to navigate our way through it and actually fulfill and follow through on all the guidelines set forth by past information and knowledge is that we ourselves are struggling with it. We're trying to manage our own time. We're trying to find out, okay, when do I put it away? When do I spend time with my family? And as long as we're struggling with something, it becomes increasingly difficult to then give over appropriate boundaries, give over appropriate moderation to our children as well. When we start looking at our particular survey that we sent out, and again, I cannot thank you enough for joining us in this venture. It gives us so much information and tools to work with as we're talking about trying to develop programming, and I think this is really the first step. When we could first identify the problem. What is the scope of this issue with our students, with your children, and how could we then appropriately and adequately address the problem? So one thing we know is that there was an excellent return and response rate from all of you, the parents who are watching this, which was, to me, when you talk about statistically significant, making sure that you have enough parents who are involved in the survey, and we had well beyond 50% return and response rate, which is, I think, speaks to our community. It speaks to us as a group. The most critical theme that we found, and again I hope to repeat this many times throughout this webinar, is that you, the parents of the 5th and 6th grade students, boys and girls, were very much in tune with where they're at. And I'm saying that it's in direct contrast, because when we ran a similar study with the high school students, we did not find that to be the case. There were many gaps of communication, of knowledge, but when we were talking about the 5th and 6th grade students, you were very much aligned with where your children were at, which kind of tells us a lot. It says that this problem, it develops, the next couple of years are really critical in terms of trying to circumvent any issues that would possibly take place then, as well as it says we need to empower you at this point to say that we're going to come up across some challenges moving forward, but we need together as a team work through it and find a way to experience success. Now when I present the data that we're looking at, I'm really going to present the most critical findings, the interesting findings. We're really not going to go through everything, but if you ever feel the need to talk about it in greater detail, please, you could contact me directly here. So step number 1 is we wanted to look at the progression of time. And one thing that we have found when looking at, and I'm going to show you these results a little later, when looking at high school students, the average amount of time spent with technology on any given day is anywhere between 2 and 4 hours, which is a great deal of time. So we wanted to begin to look at in these early stages, when does that progression begin? When do they start spending more time online? And bear in mind, when they're spending time online, they're spending less time together with the family system. And that's a critical point that we really need to look at. That the more technology makes its way into your home, the less control we have as a family, the less of a unit it becomes in a sense. So when we looked at the 5th grade boys, if you'll see over here, this is the 5th grade graph. This is the 15 minutes, this is 30 minutes, this is an hour and more than 2 hours. And if you start looking at the 6th grade students, again this is boys and girls combined, the statistics. The 15 minutes became a lot less pronounced, and the half hour and the hour and the more than an hour and the 2 hours became the majority. So when we start looking at time, although this is just the basic information that we have, we clearly see that there's a progression. In 5th grade, they're spending a little less time. 6th grade, as they enter into junior high, that's when they start increasing their time or their use of the computer. I think this speaks a lot to the shifting dynamics which take place in junior high as opposed to elementary school, where friends, social circles begin to take supreme importance in a child's life, and they ultimately want to move into that world. They want to spend more time with their friends as opposed to simply being with the family. Now, I need to bear in mind, as Dr. Goldman said, this is not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. We shouldn't fear it. We should understand it and try to work with it as best as we can to begin to look at, okay, if they're spending more time, how could we manage that? How could we give them tools to deal with processing information that could be too overwhelming for them? It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just let's be aware that starting in 5th and 6th grade, the amount of time spent online or with technology does increase. And in doing so, with that awareness, we need to remain empowered as parents. We shouldn't necessarily give in to the tide which says, now you parents, I'm going to spend less time with you and more time with my technology. But we need to say, even though they're spending more time, how can we as parents remain effective, remain empowered, assume our role and responsibility as their caretakers, as well as creating healthy guidelines and constructs for them using the internet in a more appropriate way. a healthy way. The next one we're looking at is witnessing to cyberbullying, and I would say this, that by and large, the results to this were very positive. We really didn't see anyone say that, we haven't received any data saying that they witnessed it a great deal. Now again, when you get to the high school, there's certainly, these results are going to look very different. But we're begin to see now, I've witnessed cyberbullying in 5th grade, and that's never. That's at a real 0. And when you start looking at 6th grade, you're talking about never to rarely. Again, but you do see some form of increase. And again, I'm trying to point out the idea that there is a progression. There's a progression of use, and these are the most critical years of that particular progression, and we need to utilize that information to empower ourselves. With increased, one thing that we see with increased use, with increased time on the internet, is they're also going to increase the possibility and the opportunity for them to encounter things that are disturbing to them, that are going to be hard for them to process, and that's something we need to prepare for. Who's going to be there to help them process that information? I recently had a boy in my office who was overwhelmed, and again, with guys, they tend to do their best to not get overwhelmed with emotions. We do our best to hide these things. That's what we're known for. But this boy was completely overwhelmed with emotion, and he was talking about that he encountered certain things on the internet that did become a challenge for him as a high school student. And what was so kind of challenging about sort of being there with this boy and containing him and having that conversation is it kind of that outpour of emotion represented many years of sort of secrecy and keeping that to himself. And I was just imagining to myself, what would have happened if he had someone to turn to and talk to while he was beginning to encounter these things, and ask the appropriate questions of the people that he needs to ask it to, which is you, the parents, or us, the educators. What if he had those people there for him? And I think it would have been a very different experience. It wouldn't have had that built-up tension, that built-up frustration, and which I clearly saw in my office that day. So again, when we're talking about increased opportunity, increased time, it kind of equates to increased opportunity. The next one we have is cyber content. And again, we saw a progression between the 5th and 6th grade in terms of what do they actually have access to. And here you have Facebook, texting, YouTube, and photo sharing. These graphs are not, this only goes up to 10 and that goes up to 14, so you have to sort of look at them through those eyes. The numbers are a lot higher than they appear here. But what we see is increase in texting, increase in YouTube use, and increase in photo sharing. Facebook is still something that they've yet to fully grasp, yet to fully understand. But by 6th grade, what this does say is by 6th grade, most of your children, most of our students, have already accessed texting, YouTube, photo sharing, and a small minority of them are gaining access to Facebook. Increased time equals increased exposure, and ultimately the question then becomes, which Rabbi Shaka will answer shortly, is how then are we responding to their increased exposure? All the new information that they're going to encounter. But what this does say is they pretty much, by 6th grade, even though their access, the time spent with this information will increase as the years go on, at this point they already pretty much have access to most things. The only one thing that they don't is really Facebook and a few other things. Now probably the most interesting thing I've seen, probably the most critical slide that we're going to come across today, is the one which talks about computer filter. And when we think about a filter, and we attempt to analyze what does it represent in the framework of a family system, largely it represents a value. We have certain values. A yarmulke represents a value that we dress a certain way, we have a particular belief system, and we do our best to live up to the standards that are embraced or embodied by that belief system. And a filter kind of speaks to a similar dynamic, a similar family value, which values moderation, it values less exposure, it values increased self-control, but it certainly values a life where we have less access to the world, the negativity that the world has to offer. But even more than that, what a filter kind of represents is it says, let's open up some form of conversation about this. There are things on the internet that are not going to be good for you. If you're going to see them, they may be confusing, they may be overwhelming. By putting a filter, by talking about a filter, you're opening up an avenue of communication. You're saying, I acknowledge that there are things out there that may not be very good for you. And let's talk about it. As a family, let's talk about it. Let's talk about what's out there, and let's talk about how we could stay away from it. But it certainly represents a value. And when we look at our students' response, your children's response to whether or not they have a filter, the purple here, which is the majority, represents not sure, uncertainty. I'm not sure if we have a, again, this is combined statistics of all the students. I'm not really sure if we have a filter on our computer. The blue says we do not, and 21% says yes, we do. But again, it kind of speaks to the students not being aware, meaning that the conversations haven't really begun when it comes to this particular value. How do we respond to technology as a family? How do we moderate our behavior? And so much of that is reflected in whether or not we have a filter. It gives them permission. A filter with some type of directive gives them permission to talk about whatever it is that they're accessing on their on the internet. The next one we have is communication with parents. Must I say, it was quite amazing when we talk about 5th and 6th grade students. The question was, I tell my parents about the things I see online, and over here the vast minority is never, and over here the majority is always and often. So I think that speaks a great deal to what we're doing already, which is very positive. Again, this dynamic shifts a great deal in high school. But right now where we're standing, the communication is in place. They're talking about it, they're engaging you, and we kind of need to use that as a stepping board to further exploration, further conversations, and further communication about this very large issue. But again, I included this slide because it was, not to say it was shocking, but it was certainly refreshing to see the majority of our students really turning to their parents, when this is really that time where they too turn to their friends more often than not. And here they are, when they see things online, they're talking to you about it, they're sharing that information with you. And we need to use that to our advantage. Now again, I included these slides not to scare you, but to really talk about what the future holds. Now we conducted a similar study with our high school students, and the picture was very different. While here the students were very much aligned with their parents, once they got to high school, the landscape changed completely, and there developed a tremendous gap in terms of communication with the parents and where they were holding and what they were doing online. But what I want to say is this: what we're learning is, over here things are good. We're in a good place. We're in a good position. But we need to know 2-3 years from now, that is going to change. So these are we were identifying now, these are probably the most critical years when it comes to dealing with this issue. And we are fully invested in working together with you in trying to help explore this issue, to come up with tools, ways that we can address it. And I really look forward to that. What I want to look over here is how many hours do you spend online each day. This is 5 or 6 hours. This is 0 to 1, a minority again, and over here is 1 to 2, and 3 to 4. So you're talking about in high school, the landscape, a complete shift of the landscape of hours spent online. And when we talk about hours spent online, you need to bear in mind these are hours spent away from the family system. And over here, again, it's a slide that could very well be disparaging, but it's not intended to do so. It is intended to let's critically look at what we're facing, and let's address it appropriately. Do you visit websites that your parents disapprove of? The minority is no, and the majority is yes. So we're talking about a very different picture. So to theoretically avoid this, and to create communication, we really need to start thinking about how can we develop a healthy environment, how can we develop a system that really that caters to growth and caters to communication. Some of the basic, one of the reasons why it's so hard to communicate is what happens. Let's start looking at what happens if that communication is not developed right now, and we don't open up those lines of communication, and we don't start talking about these things more openly. We'd have to expect that they're going to start asking questions to strangers, exploring other areas of uncertainty. There's no greater place than the internet to begin to explore areas of the unknown. And there tends to be tons and tons of different opinions and very often thrusts you into a world of greater uncertainty, while the intention was to come to some clear understanding of it. However, we need to bear in mind, if it's not us communicating with our kids about this exposure, it will be somebody else, or it will be something else. They will be learning about these areas, and they will be exploring them, because that's natural for them to do. But we'd like for us to be the ones that they ultimately turn to. Why do we ultimately resist this? Why is it hard for us to have these types of conversations? Number one, just to acknowledge, it's difficult. It's not easy when we talk about the conversation, which every psychology book ever written since, I would say, the 80s has said, have a conversation with your kid about sexual development. Yet when they do research on it, they find that there's still only a minority of parents who have that conversation. So if that's the case, why? We all know that's what we're supposed to be doing, and they tend to stay away from it. And the answer is, it's hard. It's hard to have conversations, especially if it's not a part of what we typically do. Number two, if you acknowledge a struggle, if you point out that something is there, then it tends to make it more real. And again, something we pointed out before, that if we ourselves are struggling with something, we've yet to make full, complete sense of it, then we tend to give over those ambiguous feelings to our children, because we've yet to be really resolved with it. So what can we do? And Rabbi Shaka will elaborate on all of these. But what can we ultimately do? One second, I apologize. Is talk, create an open and honest environment where these conversations, these forms of exploration can be present, can become a part of the language of the family. These values that we're talking about before, what we believe in, that they could begin to start communicating and conveying these values to your children so they understand them and they have a clear understanding of, this is what our family believes in and this is why, and this is how we go about embracing this particular belief. Embodying delayed gratification, I can't tell you how much research there is on the subject of delayed gratification. For those who are familiar with the famous marshmallow study, with kids who have the ability to say, I'm going to wait a little time so I could get more marshmallows. They follow those children, and they have found that they've experienced a great deal of success. Patience, as well as realism, being realistic, like Dr. Goldman said, and talking about appropriate expectations. And most importantly is the modeling piece, as a family learning to model appropriate behavior. And to elaborate on this, I'm really going to turn it over to Rabbi Shakit. And again, it's been a real pleasure working with him on this project. And I thank you so much, and hopefully this is just the beginning of our communication.
Thank you, Dr. Perman, Dr. Goldman. It's been a labor of love, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to work with you. I'd like to break up my short, brief presentation into two areas. What you can do for yourself as a parent, and what you can do with your children interactively. And what you can do for yourself is very, very simple. There's two things that based on when I'm looking at the evidence, what I thought is appropriate is, number one is that a lot of parents seem to not have filters, and getting a good filter is something that you ought to do, strongly encourage. And some that you can find online, just a simple Google search will come up with basic ones like K9, NetNanny. There's some McAfee products, which have all received wonderful reviews. And the other element, although most of it, as we've been talking about when it comes to computers, there's also the element of the cell phone. And as smartphones become ever more common and no longer a luxury but a necessity, and children are probably not that far behind if they already have it, if they don't already have it, is what they can and can't do on their cell phones. And there are many different options that one can do to place limits and filters on the phones, whether they're smartphones or regular feature phones, as they like to call them, whether through your cell phone provider or through products that you can get certainly through the web. Some of them, can run up to $100 a year. Actually found through some researching of this that it's not always the case that the most expensive product is the best ones that have received the best reviews. Switching over to what you can do with your family, with your children, certainly in the teenage years, is that we have to recognize that just like when, years back when there was something called a TV, and that's what lots of people had in their homes, and kids spent a lot of time watching, just like we knew what the limits a lot of times that we placed on our children in terms of how much time we let them watch TV, the same thing is true when it comes to internet access. And again, there's no one particular time frame that is appropriate. Every parent has to make that decision for themselves and with their spouse. But to come together as a family and figure out what's going to work for your family. And that speaks to the supervision and accountability, because when you place the limits on your children, you're able to appropriately accept what's going on. Because if a child is spending way too much time online and then things are not happening the way they should be, well, that's where being a parent comes in, and it needs to be taken care of. And sometimes, although you may think it's too late, may not necessarily always be true. Another element is about talking to them about what appropriate use is. We found that, Dr. Perlman right before me stated, was that there were many children who weren't sure if there was a filter. In fact, I believe when we were conducting the study, and I happened to have been in the room when the children were doing the study, more than one child asked me, "What's a filter?" which made it very difficult to answer the question correctly, and that's because they don't even know. And so, having a conversation with your children, not just about, if you feel like you want to share anything with me, feel free. The conversations that we need to have with our children should be a little bit more guided in terms of, okay, this is what a filter is. This is what it can do. This is what we're setting up. These are the kinds of sites we're not going to allow. When the children feel like they understand what you're doing, and you're open about it, and you're not spying on them, they certainly will feel more respected. They feel like they're a partner in this together with you, instead of something that's bearing down on them. They'll feel respected, and additionally, they will also feel secure that their parents are in fact being parents, which is what our children really want us to be. Another thing that we found is that a lot of kids knew that there were rules, but weren't really sure what the rules are. And so something along the lines of whether they need to be, I would possibly even recommend, some sort of written list of rules, maybe you keep by the computer, so that the kids know exactly what is okay in our family and what's not okay when it comes to our internet and technology use. Because although sometimes kids say there are rules, if you ask them, okay, well, what are your family rules? They may not, very possibly we're not able to tell you what they actually are. But being concrete and being clear on what is acceptable in our house and what's not acceptable in our house certainly makes them clear and really recognize what is okay and what's not okay. As Dr. Perlman stated before about what are family values, and that speaks to boundaries, which Dr. Goldman said had spoke before again as well. And finally, the general, which is what Dr. Goldman spoke about earlier, about yes, it's important to keep lines of communication open and to engender that opportunity so that when kids have an issue, because they know how clear the rules are and they know what's acceptable, when there's something that's gray, there's more of a likelihood for them to come and talk to about it. And as Dr. Perlman said before about how, although it's really in the high school years where they stop sharing things, but if we can harness and engender the communication at an earlier stage, there's a better chance that when they do grow older to that high school stage, that they will be doing the things that we want them to be doing and not doing the things that we don't want them to be doing. Finally, and I thank Dr. Perlman for this, for pointing out this YouTube video to me. This is a link to a YouTube video a couple years back that talks about, or actually really demonstrates, because there's not really any speaking, that demonstrates how much we are really connected to our phones and our technology, and how we can really benefit from trying to take a step back and realize what we actually are doing. And we will share that link with you as well. And I thank you so much for for your time. I'm going to show.
Just do the next slide.
I apologize. So I thank you so much for your time. We welcome you to contact us directly. Our email addresses, if you don't know them, are posted right now on the slide. We thank you so much for your time, and we appreciate the opportunity you gave us to present this hopefully helpful and enjoyable webinar, and we wish you a wonderful summer, and good luck.